So Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time. A quick note to everybody here about Ryan. I've known him for several years through my roles on the solution provider side. And when I decided to embark on Safeguard, one of the first people I talked to was Ryan. I think, Ryan, you're the first person I grabbed coffee with in person to tell you about this crazy idea. And I said, what do you think about fraud, identity, and compliance leaders coming together? And what do you think about them coming together across different industries? And you were totally in support of it. You told me you'd show up to it, and that meant the world to me. So I just want to thank you for that. But I'd love for you to tell the audience your background, where you've been, and what you're doing now.
Sure. Wow, I'm honored to know that I was one of the first to be
The
contacted
first, actually.
Wow,
You're
the
probably the
first.
first person I told in person. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, glad to hear I was a day one supporter. I'll give you a little background about me. My name is Ryan Hunter. I've been in fraud prevention for over 10 years. I started my career over at Upstart doing personal loans, and that's where I got my feet wet and started learning about fraud. I pivoted over to a company called Deserve, doing credit cards as a service, where we launched credit cards for banks, techs, brands, etc. Launched cards for like Sallie Mae Bank, get Rocket Signature Card, AMC Theaters, BlockFi, etc. And then I've been at Bilt Rewards for close to 2 years at this point, and Bilt is a loyalty platform. We also have a co-branded card. And yeah, so I've been doing all things fraud prevention over here and sort of, focusing less maybe on customer onboarding and more about just total customer lifecycle, login, points, fraud, et cetera, the whole kind of from a loyalty platform. And yeah, I've been here for 2 years and excited to talk about AI and all things fraud.
Yeah, well, thanks for that introduction, Ryan. I think you're being a little humble when it comes to talking about Bilt, because the kind of growth Bilt has seen, both from adoption, users, valuation, what is it worth, like $5 to $10 billion now or something. And it's insane to see how you lead such a lean team in the role that you're in. So we'll get into all of that. The reason we're gathered today is to talk about the Fraud Fighters wish list. But before we talk about what's on our wish list for the holidays, we should chat about where things are today. So I'd love to get your sense of today, where is AI actually helping identity teams?
Yeah, I think AI is a incredibly useful tool just from the surface level for doing things like summarization, enhanced due diligence. I see it being used a lot in compliance teams as well. I talk to a lot of people outside and they do a lot of, enhanced due diligence to sort of see what each, for case notes and things like that for filing SARs. And I think that's been pretty useful, but I think there's a lot more that it can do. And I think what I constantly am seeing from maybe on the vendor side is we're seeing a lot of, everyone has to have a summarization tool now, and everyone's sort of launching it as like this big feature that's coming out. But I think more often than not, some of these, summarization tools really just like writing long form exactly what the transaction says. You could easily glean from it without any additional insight or sort of useful morsels of information. So I definitely have seen that coming, in the last couple of years, but there's been a big movement towards, the summarization style tools.
And then where do you think it kind of falls short today?
Yeah, I think you just don't really get the full picture. I think one of the things that I would love to see, I think I'll just move towards sort of like what's one of the items on my wish list.
Tell us the wish list. Let's hear
All right,
it.
well, I've had this idea sort of like around a sort of like a For You page. So if you think about like a TikTok or an Instagram where you have, not that I use those, of course, but you go to the For You page and you're able to sort of discover different things that you might be interested in, and the algorithm learns with time what is interesting, what is, unique to you as an individual, and it sort of gets better and more topical with time. And I think with fraud, a lot of us are sort of stuck in this, it's either like alerts, which can be helpful, but you have to know what you're alerting for. It could be just volume things, but you have to write the alerts. It could be, sort of like graphic base where you have like dashboards and things like that, where you can monitor trends. But again, you have to build these dashboards and sort of monitor them. And I think a lot of times, while I know a lot of what I'm looking for on the fraud side, sometimes I need to discover what is happening in my platform, right? Where it's like, if you've never seen certain things that have occurred, it's hard to know that you should be monitoring, alerting, or building dashboards on it. So you think of it like, well, if you suddenly get huge spikes in applicants from a certain area code, a certain zip code, a certain state, using certain email domains or unique email domains that maybe you've never seen before, and it's unknown to you that it would be, high risk. These are things that I would love to see where it's like, just sort of like just a dash where it's sort of going down looking like, hey, you're over the last 24 hours, you experienced 300% more applications than your trailing, a 7-day average from this state or this type of email domain or et cetera. And it might be just noise. It might be nothing. It might be tied to a marketing campaign. It might be tied to something that is not fraud related at all. But I'd really love to see that sort of presented in a format where you can sort of click through and be like, oh, that's interesting, or that's not interesting, and sort of rate these sort of responses. And through time, being able to have the system learn about what is actually high risk, what is super relevant for the fraud fighter. And I think this is sort of different from a standard, like sort of the standard tools that we have today, especially some of the legacy stuff, like I said, the alerts or the dashboards, et cetera. It's sort of like more of a tool that's centered on discovery and things like that. A lot of how we as fraud fighters sort of figure out what is high risk is having cases that are either that are true losses or that have been escalated for some sort of weirdness and then digging in on those specific cases. But oftentimes that's a lagging indicator, right? And the fraud's already occurred. And so being able to see this stuff in real time and being like first thing in the morning, pop in, look at my For You page. Sound familiar, Matul? Like maybe that's what you're doing on Instagram every morning on the For You page. Something similar like that, where you can sort of scroll through and see exactly what's going on your systems overnight and over the last, how the trends are looking.
So I think it really is like challenging because it needs to be like client specific. So what matters for the client is the thing they need to surface. What you talked about around discovery, right?
Mhm.
Like you mentioned that like part of the job is to discover what might be happening that's flying under the radar. Like what percentage of time do you think you spend on that? And like what does your discovery process look like? Are you just ingesting vast amounts of data through various tools and like poking at stuff to see
Yeah.
if you spot an issue? Because
Yeah.
I think that that's where a lot of fraud fighters struggle, where they're like, I'm in reactive mode so often. I'm fighting fires. I don't have time to do discovery where I sit down
Yeah.
and then say, all right, like things look good, but let me go look for something that's broken.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of things. The first is every day I'm looking at dashboards that I've either created or are in my vendor portals, et cetera, just to sort of monitor the situation and look at all my, just how the numbers are flowing. Are they in line with my expectations? Is this spike relevant for something fraud related, or is it just normal sort of ebbs and flows of traffic? And so, yeah, I'm always looking at these dashboards and sort of these things. But one of the things I think that's really big is oftentimes you get alerted to problems or potential things that could be happening from like a customer service ticket, right? And I think this is, in my past job too, where it's like, hey, we have like 3 or 4 people that have reached out in the last hour regarding this thing that's sort of weird, or we don't know exactly how to handle it. And you kind of do a research on that, and then you sort of figure out what the commonality is, and then you can sort of extrapolate that and see how relevant it is by looking at your data sets. So a lot of it is like getting things raised up to you, like you said, being in reaction mode. And I think that this method of discovery, it works, but in it sort of relies on people reporting in some of this weirdness and things like that. And of course, you can do your best to alert on this stuff, and as soon as that comes in, you build an alert for the future. You build a dashboard for the future that you can monitor for. But of course, as the fraud sort of shifts and like the signals that fraudsters have kind of shifts, you're always going to be playing catch up, right? Because they're always, if they're getting caught with your alerting and you're stopping their attacks with their current solution or their current setup, they're going to change gears. And so
Yeah.
that's, yeah.
I think something I love about what you said was around like ingesting like customer support tickets. To me, I feel like that's like really interesting because maybe you can deploy an agent or some sort of
Yeah.
model that just scores those tickets and says potential risk here, like for fraud or compliance related elements that
Yeah,
you should be looking into. That to me sounds like a way to move beyond like the summarization that you talked about. There are a lot of
for sure.
maybe tools that are using AI to summarize stuff, but I think there's less that are like, let's look at other things to summarize besides what we're sending you as a vendor, but like let's try and ingest things in your system and then try and score and determine if there's potential fraud risk. Like to me, that's interesting. I mean, that some might argue you might want to use an agent for that
Mhm.
versus just using like a model that scores. What's your take on agents? Have you been thinking about using them anywhere?
Yeah, for sure. I think like to your point, like around the, reading the customer service tickets and sort of figuring out which ones could be related to fraud. I think that's something that a lot of companies are doing today to sort of surface things that might be fraud related so that people can dig into the potential problems. I know that a lot of folks are doing this for things like just like website problems, like there's some sort of bug in the code that we need to go and fix. And so if you get multiple people reporting, it'll automatically generate a ticket, et cetera. But in terms of agents, I think it's one of those things that I've been exploring a little bit and sort of reading about and trying to figure out exactly where people are deploying this for fraud related purposes. And I think one of the cool sort of things that are coming down the pipeline is kind of putting agents within the application funnel and the application flow. If you think about like a credit application, where you can be doing vendor calls and determining what step ups might be necessary for the individual and sort of asking for real time for those documents, which has of course always existed, but then extracting in real time, figuring out if it's good enough and the agent making that decision if this is sufficient. OCRing the document, making sure it has good document integrity, determining if it meets your criteria and your thresholds, and then asking either for additional documents or et cetera. So you kind of remove this friction of like submit, review, ask for more. And it can sort of eliminate some of that back and forth between, some of these like high document workflows, think like tenant screening or things like that. I think those would be big versus like something like a credit application, like a credit card application where typically they're not asking for that. They're usually asking only for, an ID or something similar to that.
Gotcha. Well, I think we've touched a bit on what's on your wish list so far. I wanted to talk about some of the things that you view are happening to identity signals with the advent of AI. I mean, I know
hmm
you got a bone to pick with reassigned phone numbers. I think when we chatted last time, we had a half an hour conversation about this. I mean, talk to me about how you see like reassigned phone numbers
hmm
as as something people don't think about that often. They view it as like an edge case, but in your view, I believe it has an outsized impact. So
Yeah.
tell me more
Yeah, I
about
think
that.
that if you think about over the last, I don't know, maybe like 10 years or maybe 5 years in sort of the fraud prevention landscape, we've really moved towards a phone is one of the most important indicators for identity. And that makes sense, right? Because phone is, it's pretty much, you don't change it very frequently. You might have 5 emails, but you usually only have one phone number. And that typically, since like the porting got changed, that typically allows you to keep your phone wherever you go. Back in the day, you moved your house and your phone number stayed with the house, right? But now you can port your phone and keep it going to your new telecom companies, et cetera. So it made sense, right, that we're going to lean on this versus some of these other identity elements, like even device, you change that every couple of years. And so what you see is sort of like these fraud companies, I think, relying heavily on phone in their scoring models. And when you start relying on one signal, I think, and you sort of start the fraudsters, like as fraud companies start over optimizing on that one signal, fraudsters will take note, right? And so what you see is that if I control this phone number and that's associated with this identity, I can sail through all sort of validation efforts and verification efforts by different sorts of companies. And so one of these things that I think is, like you said, is like, it's not really an edge case, which is people who give up their cell phone numbers. I thought this was crazy. I was like, I have had my cell phone since I was like in my cell phone number since I was like seventh grade, right? I've never changed it. I'm in my 30s now. I probably never will change my phone number, but I talked to a few people in the office and it was like 20 to 30% of people have changed their number in the last like 5 years. And it kind of blew my mind. And it was sort of like, well, I wanted a different area code or I had like too much spam on my last number, et cetera. And a lot of people end up changing their phone number. And so what happens is your phone number that you've kind of had for 10 years, it's associated with your identity. And then when you give up this phone number, it's not a port. It's not anything like that. The number goes back to the pool that the like mobile network operator, like the AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobiles of the world have, or sometimes the MVNO, right? The Mint Mobiles, the Visible, whatever. It goes back to their pool of numbers to reassign. And actually, your phone number has to be reassigned within a certain period of time. It ages for about 45 days. And the companies are required to give out the phone number. This is to prevent, there's only a limited number of phone numbers. So they don't want these companies hoarding them. So they are actually required by federal law to give out these phone numbers quickly. So your phone number that Mitul has had for 10 years is now someone else picks it up 45 to 90 days later. And if they apply for some sort of product, and they might be shown as Mitul, right? And if, let's say in a non-nefarious use case, this person is off the charts risky because it's like, I have Mitul's phone number, but I'm applying as Ryan Hunter. And so, this is like, whoa, super mismatch on the data that historically has always been associated with Mitul. And so what we see is that that's like the non-nefarious use case. But if you think of this, like, if I can get reassigned and I'm a bad guy, I say like, well, who owned this phone before me? Okay, it's Mitul. I'm going to apply as Mitul. So now you own his phone number you know his name, maybe you know his DOB, all these things that you already have, and you can sort of take this information and sort of use it in a bad way, right? And so you see this a lot. There's things to prevent this, right? There's some of these tools and techniques that you can use to prevent this, but it's one of those things that it's sort of not addressed with like current solutions, I think. And of course, like they look perfect. They're in the lowest quartile of fraud risk if your phone and your everything looks perfect, you know, things like that. And especially as you think about like different sort of products that are like instantly issued or like, you know, personal loans or credit cards with instant access, et cetera. This can be like you can have really outsized impact there. And so I'm reassigned phones is something I'm always thinking about. And just like phone numbers and identity is like when you sort of say that phone numbers are an essential part of your identity and the most significant part of an identity, we're sort of offloading some of our fraud risk to the phone to the telcos, right? And saying like they're
Yeah.
responsible for managing this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think even just zooming out, I think you picked a really good example of a problem where the question is, whose issue is it to deal with? Is it
Mhm.
us creating better defenses? Is it telcos? Is it the phone identity verification vendors out there that do a lot, but like, is it their responsibility to also cover that edge case? It's one of the wicked problems in fraud that I think about, which is like there's a attack vector that's poorly guarded, but whose job is it to fix that or cure that, right? Because
Mhm.
for vendors, if you look at that, you might say, all right, well, I'm not exactly sure how to step in to solve a reassigned phone numbers issue. So
Yeah.
question one is like, can I even solve that problem? And then two is like, is it frankly profitable for me to chase that problem, right? Because as a vendor, if you're building something in the space, you also have to figure out if there are like economics in there for you to take. And because it's unclear
Yeah.
who's responsible for solving it, I think it's one of those problems where you sit as a vendor or builder who might say, that's a great problem. I want to dedicate time to solve it. But the question is, who's going to pay me for that?
Hmm.
Right? Like, who should be paying
Yeah.
me? What is the amount that I can extract from that? And so it's to me pretty similar to how we think about like the impact AI is having on reducing the cost of attacks. So Ryan, like
Mm.
another question that I think about often, and when I think about AI's impact on identity signals, is if it's so easy to launch a fraud attack, then even if you have a vendor that's stopping like 100% of the
Yeah.
attacks you're seeing, but if the volume is just sky high because the cost is low to launch the attack and you don't have a way to like stop a high volume attack coming from a single attacker, your vendor might be patting themselves on the back and saying, look, I caught everything. You saw I caught everything. But if they're charging you 25 cents for every time
Hmm.
they caught something, you may just be underwater because you might say, look, like I've lost more money paying the vendor than I did on if I had just let that attacker go through once. You
Hmm.
get what I'm saying? Like the
Yeah.
economics are really starting to feel concerning to me when attackers can just launch way higher volumes of attacks.
Yeah.
We get
And I
stuck with the bill.
For sure. I mean, like, and that's it's the great arms race, right? And I think that the at the end of the day, the fraud SaaS companies are the winners, right? In the sense that, like, you know, the more sophisticated the attacks get, the more sophisticated the tools have to get, and of course, with more sophistication comes higher cost. And I think, to your point, like, I think when attacks get so expensive to stop, you have to get earlier and cheaper signals to start diverting traffic to potentially lower cost ways of stopping. So if you think you're getting like hit with major bot issues, right? Something like that. It's like, yes, you could just be running vendors and you could be getting charged multiple cents per bot. But if you have tens of thousands or hundreds or millions of bots, it's like that gets expensive quick. So it's like, how do you recognize that these people are all, you know, bad actors and bots? And can we send them down? Maybe, you know, I talked to someone recently, a fraud, you know, fraud fighter, and he was saying that they had this problem, right? Where there's like they didn't want to pay X cents per call to stop all these bots coming in and hitting their website. And what he was saying they did is they put them down to, you know, sort of like a honeypot where they thought the bots thought they were on the real website that looked, you know, legitimate to them. But at the end of the day, they were never going to get through. And so it sort of diverts the traffic from some of these bot guys into a part of the website that doesn't exist for real people, but only for these, you know, people who are bots. And so I think that was an insurance company, and that's what they were doing because they were seeing a lot of these bot attacks and sort of just diverting traffic to the dead ends, which had zero cost, right? And so they would basically flag that this was happening, divert that traffic somewhere else, and stop paying, you know, these high vendor costs. So yeah, to your point, I think it's an important distinction. But I think there's ways around it where it's like you're only doing your real expensive stuff down funnel versus like top of funnel. So it's really a top of funnel versus bottom funnel.
Awesome. Well, look, before we move on to, I think, the next section, I did want to press you on one other really frightening trend, which is the ability to use like Nano Banana and some of these emerging image models to just create fake documents. Like, and I know it's an arms race, but like, how do you see this really playing out? Because always feel like the technology advances, we try to react. We're like, hey, like, we're looking at it on a pixel by pixel level, and that's not consistent with how a real photo would be generated.
Yeah.
And we're doing all these things to try and see if there's ways to detect that it's originated from these models. Man, like, it's scary to see how you can convince some of these models to create fake documents. I mean, I'm like,
Yeah.
where do we go if we can't use documents, which have been like the traditional, like, higher friction, pull out your wallet or go get your social security card and go somewhere to
Mhm.
show it? Like, what do we do? Because if it's that easy to kind of create these documents, like,
Yeah.
how do you envision this all unfolding?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it is scary because previously a document request was sort of like show me the source of truth, which is like show me that you are who you say you are because I have signals that say that you're not that person. And so it's like, hey, you get an ID in selfie, it looks like the individual, it matches the information on the thing. That's pretty much good, right? But with the advent of like, and this has always been a problem, right? With like people creating really good fake IDs, but just the cost of creating fake IDs has come down. And I think that was sort of what you were talking about on the cost of stopping fraud. If you can create 100,000 fake IDs for cheap and make them convincing, it really comes down to how are we going to stop this, right? Because we're going to start seeing more fakes than real identities someday. And I think one of the things is about relying on real sources of truth. And so you can start thinking about like I know there's like a lot of like these DMV checks and AMBA checks on the license side. And I think there's going to be less reliance on just the actual physical license or the physical bank statement or whatever. And it's going to be, hey, sorry, you need to connect via Plaid, or you need to connect your payroll via this product, right? And I think it's one of those things that I think we're going to see more and more where I can't allow you to upload this document because I cannot validate that it's legitimate or not. I know I'm going to get like 10 DMs from fraud vendors being like, actually, we solved this. But it's like there's a ways around that, right? Where it's like if you send me the PDF, absolutely, like we can tell there's edits, we could do whatever. You take a picture of that document and you do, or you make some weird, you print it out, etc. You take a picture of it, like it gets harder,
Yeah.
right? And it's like it's always like, well, if you allow that, why don't you allow? If you allow like documents, how do you not allow an image of the document, right? So it's sort
Yeah.
of like, how do you sort of figure this out? But I think it's always going to be moving towards the source of truth, which is like, how do we get the source of truth, right? That's what happened with
Yeah.
synthetic identity fraud. Now we have source of truth with ECBSV. That's how it's going to be with some of these other vendors too.
Building AI ready and AI forward systems.
Hmm.
And I want to start with the team that you have in place. So you run an extremely lean team. How do you just think about staying lean in the face of so much growth? Because we've talked to people on here that have massive teams, but they've also got massive user bases that they work with. When we look at you, you've got a very lean team and you ingest an insane amount of users and traffic on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I am always thinking about, which is how do I keep my team lean and what tools can I use to sort of make decisions in real time without relying on manual review or sort of these manual processes. And I will say that uh, that's why I'm so excited about AI because you're able to use this to sort of speed up and eliminate reviews, manual intervention. And I think that that is the key to maintaining a lean team is not relying on human intervention and saying like, what product can I put here in order to replace, hiring a huge team of analysts to like review transactions. That sucks for everybody. That sucks for us because we got to hire a ton of people to do manual review. Sucks for the manual reviewer because it's not very fun to review 100 applications a day. And it is also not very fun for the applicant because they have a slower time to an approval. And so, or decision period, right? So getting these things in real time is important and just always iterating on your rule set. You're never going to be perfect, but always constantly iterating on your rule set. I think it's something that we also think about as in terms of like continuous validation versus like, let's build a super heavy front door and block a ton of people and, blocking 8% of their highest risk traffic or whatever, what some institutions do. It's like, I'd rather, see what you're doing on the platform and sort of, are you doing high risk things? Are you doing suspicious things? Is there things changing, right? Information, devices, IP, whatever, are things changing and sort of making decisions if you're at the point of trying to do different actions as opposed to saying like you're in or you're out. And of course, that could be different on if you're doing like credit card lending, right, or something like that, where it's, hey, if you let them in, you're wrong. It's a $15,000 loss, versus like, if you have maybe a lower risk type of platform, you can kind of make those decisions. But that's something I'm also doing, right, which is eliminating friction for as many people as possible via AI and some of these like continuous scorings.
Yeah, I'm really interested in seeing if AI can look at bad transactions that have happened. And what we've typically done is like, you pop open like the full story or other tools that are out there and you go and watch what somebody was doing, right? And you
Hmm.
examine it closely. I'm hoping that like AI lets us, okay, see that these 50 bad transactions have these particular patterns in common. And you might stumble on something that you didn't even know was a risk vector in your system that you might not have caught by just watching their movements, right? So I'm curious to see if AI can summarize big amounts of data like that to just
Yep.
let us react faster, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes you might not understand that somebody posted a video on TikTok with a loophole on how to, it's like scam you. And you're like, okay, like I don't know where this came from, but something like AI could possibly process the bad transactions with enough data effectively enough to reveal patterns that would take a lot longer to like manually sort through, right? Like that's one way I think about how teams like yours that are super lean
Yeah.
could be used in this sort of
I
solution.
also love Full Story. I think it's a great fraud tool. I always tell people this, which is like, it's a great tool for CX, right? Where you're like trying to figure out why someone's having an issue, but also just for fraud. It's like, if you can sort of see how people are interacting or with your website, even if it's not resulting in some sort of action, like, hey, they're all clicking the same pathway, like immediately, right? You kind of can see, what's going on, and you can. It's like a good tool for discovery, right? Whereas it
Yeah.
can sort of tell you what intentions are, even if they don't succeed in those actions. So that's a good tool or tools like it.
Awesome. Well, look, we're running out of time. If anyone's got any questions for Ryan, please drop them in the chat. I'm going to ask one more question, maybe, Ryan, for you while people can
Mhm.
gather their thoughts. What's one thing that you think teams need to either rethink in 2026 or like what's at the top of your wish list in 2026 from vendors?
Yeah, I think that for 2026, I think I really want to hammer at home about like the continuous validation piece. I think that that's a really big kind of unlock for me, which has been, hey, if you can sort of collect data at every single interaction, you can see how the customer journey sort of evolves. And I think that a lot of people have a lot of vendors up front. They have 5, 6 vendors up front. They're doing KYC, fraud, compliance, all sorts of stuff at the front door, as you should. And then they sort of like later on, it's like, hey, maybe we do like a two-factor, like adaptive two-factor authentication on login if it looks weird. But they're not collecting data on like some of these other things, like maybe the first transaction, the first high risk thing, how soon from approval are they changing certain things. And I think that sort of having a continuous sort of scoring of the individuals has been a big unlock. And sort of just collecting signals throughout the customer life cycle that other folks might not be doing. And I think that's something that I call it like the fraud customer life cycle, which is like every single high risk checkpoint, we're sort of painting a picture for the individual, and it can really tell you a lot. And so like a lot of times fraudsters will invest a ton on the initial interaction, and then they'll sort of their OPSEC will kind of drop and they'll kind of blow it later on, where you'll be like, oh wow, this IP is actually from this country, right? And so you're able to put the picture together on subsequent interactions because they just don't have the same sort of setup that they do on the account creation side.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I'm just imagining somebody that like got through all the defenses and then their fourth session, like a week and a half later, they've got an IP base out of like Russia and they forgot to
Hmm.
turn on masking.
Yep,
It's
exactly.
really interesting. We've got a question. Interesting. Are you seeing an uptick in synthetic identities or AI generated documents? I mean, it's around like
Yeah,
what signals are decaying the fastest over the past few years,
yeah.
but specifically they're asking about like, are you seeing synthetics or AI generated documents more and more?
Yeah, so level set. Like first, like if we're defining synthetic as like somebody who has some manipulated identity information, usually SSN, I'll say that that is not something I'm seeing as a increase. You know, I think, in fact, I think that synthetic identity fraud is maybe on the decline because I think it's more or less a sort of solved problem. I mean, you're never going to eliminate it completely, but there's great tools and solutions out there to sort of fight that kind of fraud. On the AI document front, absolutely. I've been seeing more. I saw the first one a couple years back and I was like, this is crazy. This is like so good. But I think we're seeing more and more of that with time. And I think especially in companies that maybe are asking for pay stubs or bank statements, et cetera, you're going to see a lot more of that, which is, hey, take this like Bank of America statement and change the name and address and transactions on it to be the exact same font. I think we're going to see more and more of that kind of stuff, and it's going to be very difficult to catch. But I'm definitely seeing more of the AI stuff in the document space.
Gotcha. Yeah. The document space is a scary space to be in for the purposes of fighting fraud. Awesome. Well, thorough and great question. Ryan, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being an early believer in Safeguard. We look forward to anybody here that's thinking about or considering coming to Safeguard. We hope you apply. If you're a practitioner, it's a free ticket and a $750 travel reimbursement for you. You can learn more at safeguardevent.com, and feel free to spam Ryan's LinkedIn DMs with any other questions that you might have. I'm sure
Yeah,
he's going to hear
connect with
from a
me.
bunch of folks.
Connect with me. I love talking to fraud fighters, so connect with me.
Awesome. All right. Thanks again, Ryan. Appreciate your
Thank you.
time. Take care. Bye.